Hello and welcome to the In the Trenches podcast. After a 2-week hiatus, we are back. It is the day after budget day. Still maybe a little bit hungover, not really, but taking in all those numbers at once was a lot. But I am pleased to welcome my wonderful co-host Ernest Snooks and someone who we're going to have to start calling a co-host of the show as well, Mr. Renaud Brossard for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and a man who loves numbers and loves politics more than we do, I think. So, Renaud, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing pretty well. What about you guys?
Living the dream.
Oh yeah, it's here in God's country. So the budget came down. You were in St. John's. You got to experience the wonderful St. John's hospitality, and the budget. So, what's your first thoughts?
I mean, St. John's hospitality is great. The budget itself, meh. I don't think there's actually a better word than meh. Because we were talking about this off the air, but if you would have asked me like a week ago what I expected from this budget, I would have thought a lot more spending, maybe some new taxes. I wasn't sure, but mostly a lot more spending. And good news is there's not a lot more spending. There's no new taxes, so I guess at least they're not being that terrible. But so yeah, there's some good stuff. But then again, when you look at it, you look at the state of the province's finances. Simply holding the line on spending is not enough. There's been, it's been a year since the Green Report was tabled. There were a bunch of suggestions to eliminate waste and spending. And we're not seeing a lot of it in this budget. So it's really a continuity budget.
It really is. And I mean, like, I was pleased to see that the deficit, or the projected deficit, I should say, is down to $351 million.
Mm-hmm.
That actually does make me happy. It's still a drop in the bucket when you compare it to the actual debt that the province owes, because I mean, we do owe somewhere, I think it's around $40 billion.
Yeah.
So that the idea that we're going to get to what was this? When were we getting to surplus again?
26, 27. But here's the thing: like this, it's a $350 million deficit. It's good because it would. The last time that they put some numbers out, they were predicting something like 550, if I remember well. So it's down by about 200 million. That's good news because that's 200 million bucks worth that won't be put on a credit card, and for which Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are not going to be stuck paying interest payments on for decades. So that's good news. But that being said, taking 5 years to eliminate a $350 million deficit, it doesn't look like there's a lot of efforts on the part of the government to actually get rid of this deficit. And sure, like there's a couple of mentions. There's talk of a balanced budget legislation, which is very positive, of introducing a future fund, which is also a very positive thing. But when you look at the numbers, it's like they're going to balance the budget, but it's kind of a secondary objective for this government.
Oh, sorry, Lenny, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just looking at the cost of living thing here. I mean, we talk about taxes, and I thought for sure, like Renaud, there was going to be a lot of tax increases to help us get out of trouble faster. But they have some very interesting things under cost of living. One is the elimination of retail sales tax on home insurance for 1 year. To me, home insurance is a necessity, just as much as food is to protect your home. It should be a complete elimination forever. Then they also talk about $7 million for physical activity grant. That should be under health, not the cost of living. Because I don't think that's going to encourage someone who can't afford to put potatoes on the table tonight to go out and join the gym because they're going to get a rebate in a year. And then another interesting thing they have here that should have probably went under climate change, because it's not going to make anything any cheaper, especially when Muskrat Falls comes online, was an additional $2 million to help transition homes whose sole source of heat is oil to electricity. The program will now provide a rebate of $5,000 to get this done, doubling what it used to be at 2,500, foregoing the fact that when Muskrat Falls comes online, it's going to be a lot more expensive to have electricity heated home than it would be to have an oil heated home.
So, you know, on that stuff on affordability, you're right that there's not a lot in this. Like, it's basically we're dealing with massive inflation. And I mean, everybody's seen it. People have seen it when they fill up their gas tank. They've seen it when they go to the grocery store. But so the government's estimates is that in the 12 months of 2022, there's going to be an average of 3.9% inflation. It's down from what it is now, but that's because we also had massive inflation in the last year. But what that means is that the cost of living basically is going to go up by about 4%. What the government is putting back in people's pockets is very, very small when compared to it. And you're right. Home insurance is essential. I would have loved to be able to applaud the government for its move to remove the sales tax on it by making it permanent. Because let's be blunt, even if we go back to more normal levels of inflation, the price is not going to go down. It's just not going to go up as fast.
That's right.
The increases are already baked into the prices. We're still going to have to pay for it. And a 1-year respite on home insurance, it's a good policy. It's something good for the short term, but it doesn't do anything for the long term.
Right.
But there's at least a little bit of good stuff in there though, because when we were in lockup, the finance minister actually talked about this and said that if things go well, if things are looking up, if the deficit is down, they might be looking at extending it. So there's a chance that home insurance, that sales tax will not be charged as home insurance anymore, which would be a very, very good development. But then again, it's something that should have been announced right away instead of doing this 1-year trial period, and then maybe if things go well, we'll extend it.
Exactly, and this is the same government who, I want to say 2 years ago, I believe they were the government who put a 15% tax on automobile insurance, then did a study when people complained that automobile insurance in Newfoundland was way too high, then repealed it and said, we're going to lower it, we're going to take the tax away, oh my God, we're a saving grace, and it's a tax that they put on there. So they have been known to jimmy with these things, and all I can is hope, and I mean, I applaud them for doing it. It's a very creative way of doing it, but it should be permanent, like you said, and this is something they like to play around with. So,
yeah, well, and they spend a lot of time talking about the cost of living, and they spent a lot of time talking about it and are doing very, very, very little. Let's not forget the taxes are basically this. Actually, your house is not your single biggest expense you'll have to pay for in your life. Taxes are. That is the most expensive thing anyone has to pay. The government has some margin to give something back to the people. It also has, of course, it still has a deficit, but it also has suggestions on cutting waste, starting to reduce that deficit. And sure, they're looking at a couple of things. They're doing an asset review. They're also talking about balanced budget legislation. They're talking about future fund. But that is not changing the expenses today. That is not reducing the expenses in this budget. And when you have a province that was very close to default, there was that letter from Dwight Ball where literally he said they might not have enough money to cover their expenses in a couple of weeks. When you've got a province that's this close to a fiscal cliff, simply hoping that the economy grows a little bit faster and not touching its spending is a wrong way to go at it.
And I absolutely agree with you. The other thing that I found, and I wish that they would make this permanent as well, is the 50% reduction in registration fees.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like I like that as someone who, I'm a vehicle owner, Lenny's a vehicle owner, and I mean, and as other costs go up, that's one cost that I'm glad is going down. Now, does it bother me that it's not permanent? Absolutely. And that's probably the only thing in addition to the home the rate. Sorry, the tax on home insurance. That's the two things I have you, because there's literally nothing else in here that gives me any form of hope. You know, there's things there for metro bus, but I mean, I'm a little bit far to take that bus, at least for the moment.
Yeah.
The gym, well, I mean, yeah, I go to the gym, but I don't think I apply.
I find the gym one actually very funny because, well, Minister Cody was very happy to say there's no tax increase, no fee increase in this budget, which, I mean, if you want to congratulate yourself on that, that's great, but that's setting the bar very low. That's basically saying, I decided not to be terrible this year.
That's right.
Great. But it's not exactly good. But that physical activity tax credit is actually paid for by a tax increase. It's paid for by the introduction of the pop tax. This is 5.1 million. That's starting in September. And I know it was promised in the last budget. So technically speaking, Minister Cody is entirely correct in saying that this budget does not increase your taxes. But this government is still going to increase taxes. It is introducing a pop tax. It is something that has a direct influence on the cost of living. It's actually an increased families' tax bills by 5.1 million bucks this year. And at a time when we're dealing with record high inflation, to add a little bit more on top of that, on very frequently purchased things like pop, is an issue.
Yeah, I think Deputy Premier Cody and our Finance Minister, I don't know how she does both jobs, but apparently that's how big of a deal being Deputy Premier is. You can also be the Finance Minister, because that's not big enough. I think she's at the point now that when she closes her eyes at night, all she sees is MHA Wakeham, and all she hears is, you can do more for the cost of living. Do something, do something, do something. And she's like, there's nothing we can do.
Well, yeah, and she said, like, you know what, I could actually imagine that, by the way. But I mean, like, there is more she could do, and you know, like, one thing I found a bit annoying was when she said, like, you know, I'd love to be able to help more with the cost of living. I would simply love to, but it's just not possible. And I thought that was the most Marie Antoinette moment that could be had in Newfoundland politics for a long time, because it was essentially, you know, I know your fuel prices are very, very high. I know it costs the everyone a lot to fill up, but at least, you know, with that physical tax activity tax credit, you can walk a bit more. You know, that'll encourage you.
Oh, and I mean, what it's putting back in people's pockets versus the increase, even the government revenue increase that comes from inflation, because the government actually gets rich off of inflation. Sure, personal income taxes are indexed, thankfully. That's not the case in Nova Scotia and PEI, by the way, but they're indexed in Newfoundland at least. But corporate taxes increase whenever inflation is up. Corporate tax revenue, I mean, increases. Sales tax revenue also, because if the price goes up, well, your 15% tax bill as well is going up. So it's all of those different things increase too. So the government is profiting heavily from inflation. And to give back a physical activity tax credit, we're talking about pennies on the dollar that are given back. It's not even symbolic at this point.
Oh, and one thing I'm just going to kind of move this a bit forward here. Remember, there was one thing I was talking to you about off the air, was about the infrastructure spending, which is this is my favorite kind of thing here, because I do like my economics. Yep. And you know, it says they're going to spend $567 million for infrastructure projects. That'll create 3,200 jobs and generate $390 million in economic growth. Sounds lovely until you kind of compare those numbers and you realize, wait a minute, we're spending more to get back less. And these 3,200 jobs, that's pretty much just an EI top-up job, because infrastructure work is temporary work. And so these guys are going to finish their work. And they're going to go on EI, and that's going to cost taxpayers, because that's what it does.
I mean, not necessarily though. And to be fair, there's people that work in construction are not necessarily in EI. They just go from contract to contract, and that's the case with these infrastructure jobs. But I think that's a wrong way to go about presenting infrastructure. The reason why we build infrastructure is not a job creation project. Infrastructure is basically a fancy word for roads and bridges. That's what it is. You don't build a road to create jobs. You create jobs incidentally when you build a road, but you build a road because you need a piece of asphalt to go from point A to point B, not because it's going to create X many jobs. It reminds me of a quote from Milton Friedman when he was so Milton Friedman did a trip to China at some point and did tour a bunch of different sites where he was showed by the Chinese government the superiority of the communists of the communist system, and they were showing him, I think it was this canal that they were digging, or anyway, they were digging something. And they said, the workers are using shovels to dig the canal. And he said, well, why are you not using like any heavy equipment? Surely there's a better way than using shovels. And the central planners responded to him, oh, no. See, you don't understand. We use shovels because it creates jobs. And he just responded, well, at this point, you should use spoons. Like, you're going to create even more jobs. The point is, the reason why you're building infrastructure is not job creation. If not, we'd basically be, digging a canal with spoons, or hand building every road as if it was some artisanal stuff. You do it because you need a way to get from point A to point B, and that's it. So the whole job creation aspect is good. It does create jobs, but that should never be the focus of infrastructure spending.
And it's kind of you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's like I said off air too, is that these are only temporary jobs, which is for me, I don't like that word. I don't like temporary. I like permanent, because permanent means that they're permanently contributing. Direct. They're getting this income, they're using it in their area, things like that. So if they're going from these projects to projects, let's just say, they're going to go to another place and put that money in, and it might not necessarily be Newfoundland. So, I don't like this. I like people to be within the province, generating. Yeah. Sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, Dad. That was kind of what I was trying to say here, and like that's what really disappointed me about this budget, is that they're talking about generating economic growth, but they're literally doing nothing to actually generate long-term sustainable economic growth. There's nothing in this budget about it. There's no change in the air at all. Well, there's something in the air, and I'm not going to use the word on the air, but there is something, but it's definitely not change.
Well, I mean, we were seeing that out of the air too, but usually when you see the title for a budget, the title and what's in the budget just don't relate. They're not even connected. So putting changes in the air basically means, okay, so everything that had to do with change, we did it on the cover page, then we can do the rest. And that's what I meant. It's a meh budget. It's not a great budget. It's not a bad budget. I've seen a lot worse, but I've also seen a lot better. This is one of those times where you're just looking at it and you think, yeah, there's not a lot of change. There's not a lot of stuff happening. It could be worse, could be better. Just meh, just and kind of in between, in the middle. And yeah, to your point about economic growth, I mean, the province still has double-digit unemployment. That is a long-term issue, and that is something that needs to be resolved. It is going down, thankfully. According to government's projections, it's going down from 12.9 to 11.7% this year. So it's good. It's a couple of thousands more people with jobs, a couple of more thousands of people working, being able to provide for their families, paying taxes as well. Like, it's going to help the province's finances, of course. But it is going down very, very slowly. And when a province has a double-digit unemployment rate, that should ring some alarms. That should ring some bells. There should be something happening. Probably a lot of regulatory review, a lot of reviews on what the government is doing that is impeding this job creation. And once again, this budget doesn't have that. It just just keeps going along basically.
It really does. And I mean, like I'm looking at a few of the other tax credits that they've got, and they made my head hurt as soon as I looked at them. I mean, because they benefit people who already have a lot of money, or projects that are going to do a lot. You know, like for example, the 10% manufacturing processing investment tax credit. That's fine if you are a fish plant owner or a farmer already well established, or anything like that. But if you're someone who's just getting started, you know, 10% is not. I mean, it's nice to have, but it's not that much.
Well, I think I'd go at it from a different angle. Actually, I just think if the government thinks that in these industries the 10% can make a difference, wouldn't make a difference in all the industries. And that's the issue with a lot of this very targeted corporate welfare, because it is corporate welfare. Whether you give a check to someone or you give them preferential tax treatment, it's exactly the same thing. What we're trying to do when we talk about corporate welfare is actually we talk about leveling the playing field, bringing it, stopping with the subsidies, stopping with the very boutique tax credits, and instead going for something broad-based. Because yes, I'm sure the manufacturing sector in Newfoundland and Labrador needs help, but so does the agri-food sector, so does the oil sector, so does the financial sector, the service industry, the restaurant. All those people need help. And unlike some of those industries, they don't necessarily have a big lobby speaking for them. You know, when you go to the budget lockup, you're basically with a bunch of different lobbyists, and each of them is trying to fight for different special interests. In my case, it's taxpayers. I think it's a very, very broad interest, but there's some of them that are just fighting for very specific interests. And when these folks get meetings with the minister, they're not defending you. They're not defending the small business, unless they're CFIB, I guess. But otherwise, what they're doing is that they're defending their members, and they're trying to get something specific for their members. They're the very definition of special interest.
Yeah, there's two, and one of them goes back to what Ernest said. I mean, we've talked about food security. It's something that's huge for me in this province, and I think the last number they ever gave us, I think, is if we were to completely shut down and be cut off from the rest of Canada, we would have a 3-day food supply for everyone. Yep. To me, when I look at a tax credit like this and they throw fishery and farming into forestry sectors, that's all well and good in capital investment. What would have been nice is to see a tax-free investment started in opening up lands and not charging taxes for the indefinite future until we can correct this problem. So, I mean, the situation in the Ukraine is terrible. Once we bring in refugees from the Ukraine, a lot of these folks are farmers. A lot of them know how to do all these things. What a great opportunity to say, welcome to Newfoundland and Labrador. We have an opportunity for you, should you want it, to start a farm, to start a ranch, to give to the province, and to give to your family, and to help us solve a food insecurity problem while also giving you a safe place to live. Now, that's not there. That tells me they're not serious about the food insecurity that we have when they tie it into that. The other thing, I'll get to you in a second, the other thing is I get they own the college in North Atlantic. I get the film industry is starting to boom in Newfoundland and Labrador. Hollywood is really starting to fall in love with the landscape of Newfoundland and Labrador. Why does government have to put $2.6 million into a new film and production program at CNA when they've already accredited all of this to the Hollywood people wanting to come to Newfoundland and Labrador to film? Why not say, hey, Hollywood, you got the money, you love our province, we'll give you a little bit of a break if you guys can come together and put $3 million into a brand new film and production program. It worked with GM. When the college was open in Stephen Mill Crossing, GM donated cars and actually hired graduates because they were so used to working on the cars, brand new cars to be ripped apart and put back together piece by piece. Why not follow the same model with the film industry? Get them to support it. Name the program after whoever gives you the money, and they would love it. But here they got 2.6 million. It was a wonderful idea, but I think it could have been paid for by private enterprise.
There's a lot of things that could be paid for by private enterprise, but that's the government. The government doesn't like to do that. The government loves to be able to put this money there and say, look what we are doing for the future of this province. You know, it's bragging rights, and they're not going to share that with anyone.
It's not just bragging rights. It's also a comm strategy, because basically there's three parties that are elected. If the government is not getting media attention, it's the opposition that's getting the media attention. So you want to be able to put out as many announcements as possible. And it is maybe a very cynical way to look at this, but every time you have like a small subsidy announcement, that means that this might be the one thing that people talk about in politics today, and you're forcing the other folks to react on the other side of the aisle, versus having the folks on the other side of the aisle putting something out and forcing you, the government, to react. So a decent part of it is a comm strategy, but you're absolutely right. A lot of the, well, I was going to use the word investment. I absolutely hate that word when it comes to government. Everything's an investment for government. Like if I went to a grocery store and bought $25 worth of food, they'd find a way to say I invested $25 in agri-food production or something. Anyway, but whenever the government subsidizes something, it's always calculated by how much money they put into it. It's not calculated by would it have happened without this intervention or not. And you know what you're saying with the College of North Atlantic actually makes perfect sense. And there's a lot of cases like that. I was not aware of the one with GM, but one I know very well is that of Ubisoft in Quebec that has a program at a CJAP in Gaspésie to help train software developers. Why? Because they need software developers. They know they're going to hire software developers. So, you know, they can put their name to it and make an easier conduit between the education sector and where they need to work. So that is one part of the equation. The other one for the College of the North Atlantic would be, if you have more jobs available in the field, you're also going to have more students that want to study in that field. So for the college itself, there's already an interest in trying to develop that program, in trying to attract new students, but from their perspective, from their financial perspective, new consumers, and get that additional money. But of course, that doesn't allow the government to put out a press release saying that they did something.
Yes, and that's very, very true. One thing I actually noticed too about the College of North Atlantic in comparison to, say, other kind of private or even other public colleges in other provinces is that the government, more than anything, is the one who determines which programs they really want to highlight, and that's a problem because you see the government kind of looks out. It's central planning is what it really is. You know, they look out and they say, okay, there's this many things, because I'm a graduate of CNA, so is Lenny. But when I was there, it was I did non-destructive testing, and that was the thing they were starting to really tout, because it was the oil industry, and you can go and you can make loads of money and this and that, and they flooded it with students because it's a 1-year course. You can get 40 students in a class. You know, they had 2 classes, so it was 80 people. They all come out. The next group is right in there, and then you're in the workforce and you're wondering, wait a minute, where's all the jobs? Oh yeah, the last batch already got them. Oh crap.
Yeah.
And really, but yeah, so like they determine these things, and they create these gluts in the market of supply. So they oversupply heavy equipment mechanics. They oversupply heavy equipment operators. That's a big one that they churn out. Newfoundland churns out a lot of HEOs. Same with all the other trades. The one thing that the Newfoundland government does not try to churn more out of and I wish that they would, is doctors. And that's another kind of thing in here, because I'm actually shocked, and the NLMA was there, and they were very, very upset about about this budget. But they're spending, where is it? I have my notes here. They're going to spend $3 million to increase the number of seats in Mun's nursing school. So I like this idea. It's not, we do need nurses. There are other ways we can do this. Some people may not like it, but I mean, this is something I've probably talked to you about, Lenny, is looking at how we can get people from other countries in to have them on the kind of equivalent basis, things like that. But what bothers me about this is that we're not increasing the number of seats for the medical school. And right now we've got Memorial University by the ghoulies, as it were, because Renaud, I'm not sure if you've heard, the Auditor General is going through Mun's finances.
Oh, that's gonna be good.
Oh yeah, there was a meme, that sweating meme where the guy is there and the sweat is dripping out, and that was the joke was, it was like Newfoundland government is like, we are going to launch a comprehensive review of Mun's finances, and it was President of Mun that was just sweating. But like, we're not expanding the medical school, and yet here we are. We hear over and over and over, and Lenny and me have talked about this before. We have a crisis of doctors. We have a shortage of doctors, and we're not bringing them in enough numbers, and we're not also kind of recruiting and retaining them, because I know a lot of people have tried to get into medical school here. There's like this interview process. It sucks. It's stupid, and they're just not getting anywhere. So I mean, if they increase the number of seats, the chances that these people who are very, very capable goes up exponentially, and that also increases the opportunity that we're going to have them staying here. But that's government doing things without thinking, as usual.
Well, and for a lot of that, I mean, the government is good at two things. It's good at taking money from people's pockets, and it's good at spending money. It's not necessarily good at spending it well, but it's very much able to write a check. And for a lot of stuff, the role of the government should be a lot more limited in terms of doing what it's good at. Not taking more money from our pockets, don't get me wrong, they should take a lot less. But it's able to finance things very well. It's not able to operate them, though. When you put government in charge of operations for something, that's when you get very, very bloated salaries. You get very bloated costs, which are then passed on to people like you, like me, like money, to taxpayers that are going to be stuck paying for it forever. But when you can actually remove it and bring a lot more local initiative by trusting people to spend their own money, you can actually achieve a much better level of efficiency. And that's actually one of the reasons why I was so disappointed that there were no cuts in this budget. There was nothing that was going to be reviewed. Once again, it's great that there's an asset review. That's good. Some assets might be better utilized and bring more money to the province by not being operated by government. So that's a very good step in the right direction. But when it comes to spending, there's not a lot of changes. There's actually no change practically. And once again, it's very disappointing to see that.
Oh my God, it's never. I mean, like it's not it, and you're right. It's not a great budget. Thankfully, it's not a terrible budget. Like I mean, earlier. I mean,
exactly.
I'm really. I literally thought that it was going to be Siobhan Cody standing out of this in front of like this giant faucet, and she would just be like, "Good times are back, boys," and she just rolled it out, and the money would just fly out.
Yeah,
but it didn't happen. But kind of on to your point about that, like some of these public utilities that be in kind of or crown corporations that would be in the better off in the private sector. I completely agree with you. The only issue that I would have with that is how these assets are going to be divvied out, because it's easy to just say, okay, we'll just use the NLC. be easy enough to say, okay, Bill, here is the Newfoundland Liquor Corporation, the whole entire thing. Do it what you will.
Yeah.
That is not a good idea, because that's almost as bad as letting government continue to run it, because that guy will use this monopoly and jack prices up. Yeah, sorry.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's the thing. Like from the government's perspective, the best value you can get is by selling the monopoly, in a sense, or keeping the monopoly. But if you're selling it, the best value you're going to get is by selling it as a monopoly, because you do get those higher profits, and therefore you can justify a higher selling price. But that is absolutely atrocious for consumers. And let's not forget that yes, the government depends on taxpayers for revenues. Those taxpayers are also consumers. So of course, some of the better models on this were Alberta was a very good model when they did it, or BC when it introduced private liquor stores as an option. But the way you do it is by kind of morsing it off in different by selling each store or a group of stores, so that you can still have some competition in the market, so that things get better for consumers. For sure, government is going to lose out on some revenue, although usually it makes up for that with higher alcohol taxes. But getting this extra level of choice for consumers, getting that extra competition, means that the profitability in the private sector is going to be lower, but you're going to have more choices, you're going to have a better selection, you're going to have better prices, and ultimately that translates into benefits for the people instead of benefits for the NLC. Definitely.
And I got to admit, like, seeing all of this and finishing a couple of books like by DeSoto and Friedman, you want to have the ability to actually say something about it and be able to do something, because you read these brilliant economists, and then you look at what we get, and you're just like, oh God, like I just want to run. I feel like I should have jumped on that plane with you, went to St. John's, and just handed everyone in the finance department like 18 different books, and maybe just stood by them with a paddle, just to make sure that they read them, so that some of the sense would stick, because there's so many solutions that are just right in front of us, how we can address the issues, because none of these things in this budget give me as a consumer or as someone who is going to be staying here in the future any real confidence. And if I was going to be moving here, what do I get? I mean, what benefit is it for me? Oh, great! This surplus, we're gonna have a surplus in a couple of years. What's the debt again? Oh,
yeah. Well, so there's a couple of numbers that are always floated around, because the debt is not just like how much you owe on your credit card. For governments, there's a bunch of different metrics. But if we look at net debt, it's going to go up to 17 billion, 17.1 billion by the end of the year. Now, of course, you need to add to that Nalcor. You need to add some public sector pension liabilities. You need to add part of it that's, you're still paying interest on it, because net debt, you remove the assets from the value of your gross debt, but you're still paying interest on all of your gross debt, and ultimately it means a much higher bill. And right now, what we're seeing is that interest rates are rising. They're expected to keep rising as well. I mean, there's 6 major banks forecast that the Bank of Canada would increase the base rate by 0.5 percentage points next week. Just to put it in perspective, the base rate was at 0.25% for the longest time. It increased to 0.5. Now it's going to increase to 1. What this means is that interest rates on everything else are going up too. So they're going up on your mortgage. They're going to go up on your personal loans. On credit cards, I think we're still legally capped at 20, but this is not something I'm as familiar with. It's more like a rumor I heard, so don't quote me on that, please. But yeah, we're seeing interest rates go up on everything, and so does the government. The government of Newfoundland is not borrowing at the best rates anymore, unfortunately. The minister did say that they're trying to keep the rates down as much as possible, but our projections is that they're going to borrow at 3.5% this year. The average for the province so far was 3.4%. That 0.1% increase means that there's more money that is not that the government of Newfoundland and Labrador won't be able to use to fund services or to put back in people's pockets via tax cuts. But instead, that more money is going to go to bond fund managers on Bay Street, and that's exactly why the debt needs to get under control much faster. And the fact is, it's good that finally there's a date when we're going to see a balanced budget in Newfoundland and Labrador, but there's a lack of effort to get there. It could have been so much faster.
But every budget, they always say we're on track to reach surplus by X, and generally, they never do. So like I think we will see a surplus in 2027, like in 2227 AD. That's when we're going to see this, because they don't really want to do that, because you see, to get us down to a balanced budget or even a surplus is going to really require those cuts. And government doesn't think about this in the same way that you and I would when we're going over our household expenses. They have to think, okay, well, this special interest group is going to be angry at us, and
Yep.
they have X amount of members, mostly public sector unions. And I mean, I'm not sure while you were here in our lovely province, you heard some of the ads that were on the radio. It's QP, it's NAPE, they're on the warpath. And the government is really weak about things like this. As soon as the unions, the public sector unions, give them any trouble, they kind of curl up and give in a bit. So that's why I think that we're not seeing so many things from the Green Report kind of being implemented, because the government is thinking in survivability, not in long-term kind of fiscal improvement.
Well, I'm a huge fan of public choice theory in economics, which you might be familiar with, but basically is the principle that pretty much any decision you're going to make in politics is going to be about diffuse costs and concentrated benefits. And that's exactly what that's a very good example here, because let's say that tomorrow morning, every government employee got let's say that tomorrow morning, the 50,000 government employees would get $1,000 a year raise, and there would be this one policy that was being pitched. Well, $1,000 a year raise, there's about 520,000 people in Newfoundland. So for 50,000 people, $1,000 a year raise would cost $50 million. $50 million when divided by 500 some thousand people is about $100 each. Well, the government employees getting that $1,000 raise are going to be willing to spend up to $999 theoretically to defend their right to get that raise. Taxpayers, on the other hand, are going to have to pay $100 extra. Well, they're each going to be willing to spend maybe $99 to avoid having to pay for the cost of that raise. And that's how a lot of government policy gets implemented, in the sense that the cost is very diffuse. So we don't necessarily see it individually when you take it policy by policy. Taxpayers don't necessarily see it, or it's pennies on the dollar. It's not that big a deal. But the ones that profit from it are making loads, and they're very invested in defending it. And that's why when I said, there's, when you're in a budget lockup, there's a bunch of very special interest groups of lobbyists, and they're each trying to defend those very special interests. And to your point, there's not a lot of groups calling for less spending in those pre-budget submissions or in budget lockups. I know this year, when my colleague Franco was at the Federal Finance Committee trying to pitch the Trudeau government on what we thought they should do with the budget, they did not listen to a lot of stuff we said. But one of the MPs actually said afterwards, like, this is refreshing, because we've heard from 50 people so far, and literally all of them are asking us to spend more. They're the first ones saying that there should be some cuts.
Like it is frustrating. I mean, it must be frustrating for you and your colleagues like Franco and that to have these ideas and these solutions that are just so common sense to anyone who really sits down and takes time to think about them. And only, you take it to the government, they're like, oh, this is wonderful, this is nice. Let me just put this right over a wastebasket.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very I seem very pessimistic. We still get victories because we know there's broad support in the population for these things. And when we can demonstrate it to politicians, and we can demonstrate to politicians that people care about specific issues, it's possible to get those victories. Like just this year, there was a proposal to subsidize a billionaire so he could build a baseball stadium in Montreal for a part-time baseball team. We helped get that scrapped. That's a $300 million for taxpayers. We've got these victories that we get on a very punctual basis. Usually, we don't see those victories in budgets. We see them outside of budgets. We see them when we can pick up a fight, mobilize people, and have enough time to kind of undo a policy. But in budgets, often it is very much a special interest. It's very much the very, very well-connected groups that spend a lot of time and a lot of money to meet with politicians. And those are the ones that usually see something in the budget.
Well, fair. But I mean, I got to say, like, I really appreciate the work that CTF does. I mean, I'm sure Lenny does as well.
Careful, I'm blushing now.
Hey, well, listen, you've given us credit before, so it's time for us to return the favor. And we are really grateful for you coming on the show as much as you have to talk about these things with us, because I mean, it's good to have people who can come on the show who are like-minded with us about the fiscal realities and about making sure that the regular people can get by. And kind of like going a little bit more forward here, there's one other thing that I'm actually a little bit happy that they spent money on. Now, how they're going to spend it, that's the problem. The $20 million for tourism. Now, if you use it in terms of, say, infrastructure, say, because we have an ATV culture here in Newfoundland, especially around here. We're going to take you out here sometime and get you a tour of the area and that, but it would be lovely. Oh, trust me, it's we have a lot of trails around here, and the Newfoundland Labrador Snowmobile Federation, that they have been working on building these things. I think Lenny, we've seen that a few things here. We've got that new bridge built out by out in, I think it's Cold Brook there, or Knowles Pond, and that was done with I think it was a mixture of public and private efforts, because the Canadian Forces engineers came and built this wooden bridge there, but the community supplied the material. And so, I mean, all these trails and that coming together, these trail networks, that does attract investment, because I'm friends with someone who's into all of this, and he was very enthusiastic for a while about having an expanded ATV trail network to promote more off-road tourism, because they did it with the Hatfield and McCoy Trail down in Virginia, and it generated a lot of money. I looked at the report. It was amazing how much they could actually generate. And if we use this money towards incentivizing startup for private kind of businesses, in terms of like the tourism, in terms of setting up, supply routes along these kind of ATV trails, because Newfoundland has a lot of trails, because for some reason we thought it was a really, really, really smart idea to dismantle our railway network. We just thought we just woke up one day and said, you know what, by golly gee, this is the best thing we can ever do.
Yep.
Screw the rails, let's just build giant asphalt roads everywhere. That'll be all right. It wasn't. So
I mean, I still prefer seeing broad-based tax cuts instead of very
Of course,
targeted
of
stuff
course.
like that. Because I still think a lot of that would be done without the level of government spending. But that being said, our approach to budgets is not no spending. It's much more about prioritizing spending. It's trying to find like what should the government spend money on and what it shouldn't spend money on, and trying to agree on it. And that was one of our main criticisms for the last federal budget too, by the way, where what we're seeing is a lot more spending everywhere with money we don't have, where we're basically mortgaging our future. We're mortgaging our young Canadians' future to pay for whatever we want today, and it's exactly, and the same thing's happening with a $350 million deficit in Newfoundland right now. It could be much lower. The path to balance could have been much faster. So that kind of prioritization could have been good. Now, once again, like I've been very critical of this budget in the last 30 to 40 to an hour, I guess, at this point. I still want to say it's not that bad. It's meh.
Right.
It's not great. It's not terrible. Somewhere in between. And there's still some good stuff. Balanced budget legislation, it's still a step forward. It won't solve everything. It won't balance the budget tomorrow. But having that kind of legislation on the books helps create an incentive to balance budgets. The future fund is a very, very good way to start putting money aside so that when the aging population problem gets even worse, that there's money set aside to pay for programs, that there's money set aside to pay for all those essential things like healthcare and education in the province. And there's some good stuff in there. It's just that it's sprinkled in something that's basically a continuity budget instead of a change budget, and that's by the title.
Well,
I agree with you. I did notice there was one point I wanted to bring up before we close off in a few minutes, but
yep.
I did notice something else, and I know we talked about how confusing Newfoundland budgets are to read.
Oh my God.
So I made the comment earlier about how they threw in the 10% tax credit, and they put like agriculture, fishery, all that into one. Well, if you go almost to the end of this document I have under renewable resources, I will have to retract what I said, because they did put $10.9 million for agriculture development to help meet the commitment to increase self-sufficiency in fruit and vegetable production of 20% this year. So they want to increase it by 20% in 1 year. Still does nothing for the cattle industry, which I do think is a missed opportunity here in Newfoundland and Labrador, that we could be developing more ranchers as we are increasing farming. But I digress from that. And the one, as someone who drives a hybrid, who's pro oil and gas, I mean, you talk to the left, someone like me doesn't exist, and they have a conniption fit. How can you support oil and gas and drive a hybrid? Because it's called being responsible. That's what it's called. But this is kind of, I mean, we talked about a pop tax on here a few months ago, about how it was an elitist tax because it wasn't on a Starbucks drink, it was just on a bottle of Pepsi.
Yep.
Well, for me, someone who drives a hybrid does not qualify for the next thing I'm going to read, but if I had a fully electric vehicle, which would not work in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador as it currently sits, unless there's a backup gas engine, which would make it a hybrid, this is basically useless. So it's an additional $1.9 million for electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. All well and good in the summertime, as well as a $2,500 rebate for consumers who purchase or lease all electric vehicles, and $1,500 for a plug-in hybrid. So they do kind of get there. But for someone like me, I don't have a plug-in hybrid. My vehicle will charge itself as it drives. It switches between engines. I do not qualify for anything, although I'm still driving a hybrid. So if I have a plug-in hybrid, I'm okay. So my understanding of a plug-in hybrid is basically a full hybrid, is basically a fully electric car with enough gasoline to get you to the next point. For my car, I need a full tank of gas, and it'll switch back and forth depending on what I'm doing.
And you just use a lot less gas ultimately.
Right, but I get nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of an elitist tax, because for someone like myself, I mean, I'm not rich by any means. I live in the middle class. I had to buy a used hybrid, secondhand hybrid, and I could afford it.
Yep.
If I had to buy a new one, out of the question.
Yeah.
I mean, and to your point about an elitist tax, it's or an elitist subsidy.
Yes.
Let's just look at the, I don't have the stats for Newfoundland and Labrador, but look at the number of electric vehicles that are registered in the province, and I can guarantee you it's less than 1%. The reason why I know it's less than 1% is because Quebec has the highest in the entire country, with $13,000 in subsidies. Now they lowered it to 12,000, but we've had that for 10 years, and we're at 2% roughly. And that's when you exclude all of the commercial vehicles. So it's very much a tax rate that goes to a very, very small percentage of the population. That's also why, despite how generous it might seem as an incentive, it only costs 1.9 million. It's because they don't even expect a lot of people to take advantage of it.
Right.
Very, very concentrated benefits, very, very diffuse costs, and basically hoping that the folks that do get to benefit from those massive subsidies are willing to spend more to fight for them than the folks that are stuck paying for it.
Yeah. And it's
true.
No, absolutely. And I mean, like, the thing is that sorry, it's been a long day.
I get it.
Trust me, I know. But the thing that I kind of noticed here, and this is what kind of gave it away for me as well, is the lack of investment towards this electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and the way they've kind of, was it here, the way they budgeted oil. So they budgeted oil at $86 a barrel. For a province that wants to go green, they're still putting a lot of their eggs in that basket. Now, if it was me and I wanted to kind of show that I'm serious with cutting expenditures and things like that, I would have actually taken my allocation for oil, and I probably would have dropped it down, because then I'd say, okay, we're going to expect less money this year, and therefore we're going to have to cut accordingly. But since they're budgeting it at 86, it's like, okay, so you guys just make sure you spend accordingly now, please and thank you. I
gotta give them credit for realistic assumptions though, because then it's easy to try and either pad a budget one way or make it look worse the other way. At least the assumptions seem realistic on the oil price. There's another factor though that's not considered in this budget, is Baie du Nord. Because I can tell you that budget book was printed before Baie du Nord was approved, and that is going to make a difference in government finances. We're talking about more personal income tax revenue. We're talking about more corporate tax revenue, more resource revenue, and all of that is going to make a difference in coming years. So, and I guess this is one of those silver linings here, but there's a solid chance that the deficit this year is not going to be 350 million. It's going to be a couple of $1 million lower, and the same with next year, and the same with years after that. Just with the extra benefit coming from the construction, for the project development, basically.
Oh yeah, it will. But now Baie du Nord is probably not going to come online in full for.
Oh, it's 2026, if I remember well. But there's still work that needs to be done before it comes online, and people are going to get paid for that work.
That's right.
And now the other thing, kind of like, as we kind of wrap up here, about because when the government was doing the budgeting, they also said, because of lower oil production is expected for this coming year. Now that is true, but as someone who's worked on these projects in the past, they're not always as kind of time specific as they think. Sometimes they actually get completed a lot faster. So that's also another factor here. So some of these shutdowns they're going to happen, yes, and necessarily so,
Yeah.
but they might get done quicker, and that way then we might be able to get a bit more oil out. And so that could be a factor towards the revenue side of things as well. But
Mhm.
I mean, I guess this is really the most we can talk about this budget, because there's literally
Yeah.
there's nothing. It's
Yeah, yeah.
I was so excited, I was all giddy as a child for the last like couple of days. I was like, oh my God, the budget's coming. Oh my God, it's going to be terrifying, and I'm going to have something to talk about the entire time. But it was just the thing that I'm talking about almost is literally the picture on the book, the literal like
Yes.
the ocean sacrifice
Yeah.
photo. That's all I'm talking about, because there's nothing else interesting to joke about.
No,
Yeah,
it's true.
I mean, it's if I may sum it up again, it's meh.
Yeah. That's what it should have been called, the meh budget.
Yep.
Or
Yep.
the hold fast budget.
Oh my God, that actually would have been realistic. Because it's definitely not anything about change. It's just wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like you said, though, it's not as bad as the other ones. I think our budget is kind of better than Nova Scotia's.
Oh, yeah, okay, but that's setting the bar really low now. Yeah, that was not a great budget, to be honest. No, I like, once again, I think I expected a little bit more from Tim Houston, and was very, very disappointed. It was not a great budget. I expected less from Siobhan Cody, and was, I mean, say pleasantly surprised, but that's a bit of an overstatement. It's just, yeah, it's continuity. It could have been so much worse though. Like,
she'll
governments,
take the win.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Renaud, do you have any closing words? We're definitely going to have to get you back on to talk about your experience of budget day and a couple other topics all in one episode. But do you have any closing thoughts? Any closing remarks?
I mean, it's always a pleasure. I'm always happy to be back on, but I guess we can just leave it at meh.
Awesome. That's a good way. Ernest, what about you? Any final thoughts?
Well, you know what? I would call it a Met budget too, but I mean, in the spirit of French, there's a few other kind of words within the meh, maybe merde.
Yeah.
That's what I would use, but that's just me. That's the most you'll get me swearing on the show. And yeah, no, it's not the best budget. It's not the 2016 budget, thank God, because that's what we would have needed. It was another one of those. But no, it's nothing encouraging. It's nothing overly discouraging. The cost of living issue have not been addressed, which is probably the thing that I really had the biggest problem with. But budgets can change. Like, things come up unexpectedly throughout the year, so maybe the pressure will come onto the government enough that they will see a need to kind of lower the fuel taxes, especially as we switch to the summer blend, which is always a little more expensive. So that's my piece on it. But thank you so much for coming on and talking to us again, Renaud. It is really always a pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is mutual, and I always love listening to the podcast. I love coming on even more. So always feel free to reach out.
Yes, I certainly echo those sentiments, and I think we have a consensus on the meh budget, and that should be the name for it. And I still have to go through a lot of this stuff and read it over, see how it affects my life personally. I would see how it affects everyone's life here in Newfoundland and Labrador personally, and especially this town that we all know and love for myself and Ernest. And I'm sure we're going to have many a talk about this budget, or lack thereof, over a couple of beers one day. But on behalf of the In the Trenches podcast, myself and Ernest, Renaud, I'd like to thank you again for coming on. We're going to have to get you on again soon. And until we talk again, Newfoundland and Labrador, good night.
Good night.